I have been absolutely obsessed with the idea of hybridizing a lot of monsters. And honestly, at this point, I think it's time I made a video about it. So, to start with, why would I curse myself with this absolute heretical idea? Because I feel like it. And I think that the idea of making hybridized creatures is a really cool one, and one that not a lot of people really consider when making homebrew monsters. Like, yeah, you'll take an ability here, or a change or a feature there, but making full concepts into monsters that are not only usable, but also incredibly different than what their parts are would be actually kind of a neat idea. And while I'm not going to be statting or creating monsters today, though I may in the future, I definitely want to talk about just the idea of making hybrid monsters and how that could potentially be used in a game or two, along with an actual story of a creature that I use that is kind of a precursor to this idea, and what it means in my games and how that was used. So yeah, let's get started with a new episode of Quick Campaigns, where we talk about hybridizing monsters for better or for worse. I think the first thing that we have to do is establish what do I mean by a hybrid monster. And I don't mean just a monster that's made up of one or more other monsters combined onto one. I mean fully taking the idea of a monster and another monster and making them into a whole new creation. For example, instead of just giving a gorilla a basilisk stone gaze ability, why don't we make something more akin to a Goralian, where it's a multi-limbed monstrosity that burrows through rock and eats the things it turns to stone. However, it's more dangerous because it lives in the jungle, and its layers are populated by petrified trees and strange statuary of dead and destroyed creatures. Now that you have that idea, let's take this and add it to the idea of a gorilla basilisk. This thing is climbing trees and jumping down from above, using its brute strength and incredible aggressiveness in order to cause incredible damage to the party on its first attack. Then it follows up with its stone gaze, and its minimal amount of cunning in its brain would be enough to allow it to work out a rudimentary ambush using these abilities. Maybe they travel in packs and are herbivorous in nature, eating the petrified plant matter rather than directly eating meat and being carnivorous. However, they can if the need be. The idea that a creature could exist that is not only capable of being a normal animal, but still having that hybridized form is what I want to talk about and what I want to get into. So let's start with a pretty easy one, going with the basilisk gorilla that we just talked about. Let's go a little more in depth on what that could be as a creature and where it could have come from. So let's first take a look at the owlbear, which is probably one of the easiest things to make an example of when you're talking about hybrid creatures in D&D. It's not an owl, it's not a bear, it's something different. It takes inspiration from both, but is not required to be a part of either family. It's as in stated in the lore, a possible creation of a mad wizard, some sort of magical surge gone wrong. It depends on the world, but the basic gist is owlbears exist, and they are going to stay. And so, because of that, we have to deal with them. Now, when we look at an owlbear, we look at two things. Number one, we have its stats, its abilities, and its actions. Number two is its lore, and I want to take a look at that in two parts. So first things first, let's take a look at the owlbear stat block itself. So to start with, let's look at an owlbear stat block. Owlbears themselves are, if we're going by the logic of bears, following a tiered progression system of difficulty. Black bear, brown bear, polar bear, and then owlbear. Now, this isn't in any way a way to stat your creatures or follow any sort of pattern. I'm just making an observation that the owlbear itself is a little bit stronger than your average polar bear, that being a CR2 and the owlbear being a CR3. Now, what that means is it's going to be a little beefier, it's going to be a little tougher, and it's going to be a lot more dangerous to lower level parties. So to start with, if you're looking at just its stats, it's not super impressive. A strength of 20 and a con of 17 are being its only really outstanding stats, and its intelligence and charisma are absolutely abysmal. Which is not the point of the creature. It's a strong, fast, and hardy animal. It has keen sight and smell, and as well as perception +3, so already it's got advantage on sight and smell. This is actually taking reference to both the bear and to the owl. Obviously, as you can guess, because since owls have quite strong hearing and bears have quite keen senses of smell. If we skip over to the actions, it's pretty simple. Attack, multi-attacks, and that's about it. It's not the most well-built or incredibly varied stat block, but right away we can just see this simply. It's got the traits of both a bear and an owl. If we were to take the owl and have it use, for example, the falcon stat block or similar, it's quite weak, but they have keen senses and they have high perception, which would match what an owl does. Then if we look at the bear stat blocks, it has keen sense of smell as well as the ability to multi-attack. Finally, bears provide our bulk and our armor, because natural armor is a 13 and its hit points being 59, which is pretty beefy, and even if you go higher to its max possible in 91, that's still quite a dangerous outcome. Now if we turn to the lore, there's not a lot in here. Again, this is a 5th edition problem, but if you have another system that has owlbears in them, I think Pathfinder does. Honestly, go with whatever you want. But if we look at the lore, starting with the deadly ferocity, it is portrayed as a fearless apex predator in its ecosystem. Many creatures, even if they are above it in rank, would probably avoid tangling with it because it has no sense of self-preservation. It's got the ferocity of a bear and temperament to match. If we look at its other parts of its lore, it honestly is it seems like a standard apex predator, but if we look at it, it's more aligned with an owl than it is a bear. So now that we've gone through the basics of the stat block and what I think we need to draw from it, let's take a look at, again, our basilisk gorilla. What does it look like in stats? Well, right now, we're going to take a look at the stronger of the two monsters, a regular ape versus a basilisk. The basilisk is clearly on top. Its stats might not be better, but its abilities make up for that. Now, that's not to say that the ape can definitely be incredibly dangerous, and if played right by the right DM, as an animal would definitely match the basilisk in ability. But now let's look at the Gorallian, the step up from the gorilla. 4 arms, more dangerous, higher power and attack, and it has a lot more health, meaning it's much more dangerous. Now it outranks the basilisk. So if we're taking this idea of the gorilla being somewhat cunning, smart, and is very agile in movement, and we take the basilisk's slower, more methodical, and much more, not aggressive, but let's call it territorial approach to combat, and we end up with a creature that is either slow and methodical or fast and aggressive. And what do I mean here is the basilisk is typically going to be a creature that wants to target with its gaze and then go in for the attack. The gorilla, if it were to attack, would probably aim for an attack from above, using its height and maneuverability advantage in order to get the drop on people, or just throw things at people, because that's also an option. That would mean we have to deal with one of the following options: either a methodical, slow killer or a fast, methodical killer. And then we would have the option of a slow, aggressive killer or a fast, aggressive killer. Either of these options are pretty decent, though I think with the concept I have in mind, it would be a much more fast and methodical ambush predator. So now let's take a look at these two stat blocks and see what parts we want to keep and what parts we want to change between them, and what we want to compare. Alright, so if we're looking at the Basilisk and Growlin stat blocks side by side here, which I just realized I've been saying it wrong for I don't know how long. So, whoops. It's Growlin, not Growlian. So I'm not going to go back and correct that in the video. I'll just deal with it now. These are very different stat blocks if you look at them side by side. First off, they're a whole CR apart. And they have some abilities I think that we don't have to worry about. For example, by default, they have a natural armor of 15. I apologize for how bad the, well, I guess the just outcome of these screenshots is. It was really hard to get these to look at least decent. Basilisk turned out okay, but Growlin, I don't know what happened there. Actually, surprisingly, something I found out while doing this was Growlins have the same armor or hit points as an owlbear. As one of their downsides, they're not very tanky like overall. For a CR4, that's quite high, especially since they only travel in packs. But we don't need to worry about that right now. To start with, let's take a look at the actions they can take because it's the quickest one. The only thing here that I would do would be to change the Growlin's bite to include a d6 of poison damage. Not as strong as the Basilisk's, since the Basilisk has only one action, it needs only to do one, but the Growlin can make 5 attacks. I don't think we need to beef up its bite any more than adding a d6, even a d4 of damage to it. Second, if we look at its non-action abilities, aggressive, keen smell, and petrifying gaze, we don't need to change anything. We just need to combine those. Because of this, we're going to end up with a much tougher creature because it has 3 abilities, but it's not going to worry about changing or modifying any 2 of the same ability to work together. If we look at its skills, we'll use Growlin skills since it is going to be mostly ape-based, just longer with more limbs. And its dark vision and passive perception will keep it the Growlins unless we want to go with the average of 13 and 9 instead, which is what I'm doing with the stats. Stats, we're going to be using mostly the averages with a few exceptions. Since Charisma is 7 on both, it's going to stay the same. Wisdom and Intelligence, I actually want to beef up slightly. So, Growlins are implied to be somewhat cunning and a little bit intelligent. So we're actually going to leave we're going to make that Intelligence a 6, and we're going to boost that Wisdom up to a 14. This is definitely a tougher creature, but it's not going to be a huge deal in the end. For Constitution, we're leaving at 16 for all, and 18 for the Strength, another 16 in that Dex. We're going to basically use Growlin stats with a little bit of modifications from the Basilisk. So Basilisks are slow and rather unintelligent. So in that instance, we're going to move that Dex to the average of 18 and 16. Which will turn out to, do the math here, 16, 24, 12. So it's going to lower its armor from 50. Since we're not using natural armor, we're instead using, I believe, 12 plus Dex for the Growlin, which we will use. We could do the 15 natural armor, which I actually think is fair in this case. So you could either do 15 natural armor, or if you don't use natural armor, you would have 13. For hit points, we're looking at a creature with 7 d10s or d8s. Because it's going to be a large monstrosity, I think Growlin HP is fine. And it's going to have the same speeds as a Growlin. I think maybe lower the walking speed to 30 as well as the climb speed. And that means we don't have to... It's not as fast, but it's still rather quick. So honestly, in overall, we're mostly using Growlin stat block, but we're moving everything from a Basilisk over to make it much more different. And now that we have those, let's look at the lore and what we could do to make those into something a little more interesting instead of just a creature. So as you can see, I've put together a quick basic stat block for this monster. It's not perfect. I definitely think it could be better. And as well, I had to make sure Basilon, because that's what I called it, wasn't a slur or like a bad word. The only thing I could find is it's like the name of a family from somewhere. I think New York or something like that. So we don't need to worry about it, hopefully, too much. Now, as I said, I went through everything. I did all of the effects, movements over. I just realized I forgot to rename Basilisk when I moved Petrifying Gaze to this stat block, so whoops. I think the math might be slightly off. Yeah, that might be slightly off. And the bite and the claws, they're different, which makes no sense because they're both the same damage except for the poison, but whatever. So now what we're going to do is we're kind of going to talk about lore and how that applies to creatures. Now we don't need to go super in-depth with these guys because I don't think it's necessary, but we're definitely going to take a little bit of a crack at it. So what I've done is I've put together a short, like a little piece, just on like an encounter some adventurers could potentially have with the Basilon and what it might look like in your world. Now this isn't necessarily what the final lore will be, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I'm going to do just some basics. So, in order to kind of get the idea behind the Basilon put out, I wrote most of this. The rest is either polished by some friends and otherwise, and I'm going to just kind of use it as a way to narrate what I've come up with for the lore of the Basilon, it being some sort of abominant creature created with dark rituals in order to be a guardian or some other creature, and they've since escaped and become a nuisance upon the world. The Basilon is a fearsome creature born of the forbidden union of a Growlon and a Basilisk. Whispers tell of dark rituals conducted in hidden laboratories and lost ruins, where these monstrous beings were brought into existence before their escape into the wilds. Physically, the Basilon is a grotesque amalgamation of both of its parent species together. It possesses the muscular frame and agility of a Basilon, with 4 powerful arms capable of rending flesh and crushing bone. Its eyes mirror the deadly cunning of a basilisk, showing that it's not only aware of its ability, but how to use it. Inhabiting dense jungles or forgotten forests, Basilons are solitary hunters, stalking prey with a lethal combination of stealth and brute force. Their lairs are littered with the statues of unfortunate adventurers who've crossed their paths. Legends and people's tales have warned of the dire consequences of encountering a Basilon. Those who survive its petrifying gaze may find themselves cursed by nightmares, traumatic reenactments of what could have been their impending doom. Those who see its ferocity and brutality at firsthand speak of a mass of claws and teeth and destructive power, causing them to flee in terror. Only the most skilled and courageous adventurers ever even attempt to face down a Basilon, lured by the promise of treasure or driven by a sense of duty to rid the world of these abominations. But you must tread cautiously, as knowing that the gaze of a Basilon is a fate potentially worse than death. So it was kind of a rough draft. It's not the best work I've done. I definitely could do better. But overall, I think for a pretty basic rundown of what a Basilon is, at least in context of what it could be, is, I think, an overall okay job. So with that, I believe that's kind of everything. I don't actually have any plans for upcoming streams for a little bit. and I do have a couple plans for some videos, but we'll see. I have to kind of get around work and stuff like that. I'm working on these videos like a couple hours a day, max. So yeah, I guess with that, that's the Basilon, a weird little creature that I've made for hybridizing creatures, and hopefully maybe inspired you to take some existing creatures and hybridize them yourself. So with that, I'm the Dice Goblin, also known as Tiny Dice Thief, and I'll see you later.